Hello, everyone. Today we have the honor of being joined by Beth Allison Barr. And is that Dr. Beth Allison Barr?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
But you can just call me Beth, but yes.
Awesome. And so I've asked her to join us today so that we can discuss about her book. I have it right here with me, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And so this is a really interesting topic, especially for us as women to educate ourselves on, but totally relevant to men as well, obviously. And we will be talking about Beth's story, which she talks about in her book, but we will also be discussing, hearing Beth's thoughts about if egalitarianism is feminism. And we will also be talking about what is masculinity. And if there's time, which I'm hoping that we will have time, we will also be addressing some recent criticism that she's been receiving online. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let's begin. Thank you so much for joining me, Beth.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I am a professor at Baylor University. And as I told you just a few minutes ago, I've been a dean in the graduate school for the past 3.5 years. But because of the book, I was recently named the Vardaman Chair of History. So I'm actually moving back to the history department in a primarily research and teaching position. So I'm sort of in transition with my offices. So this is the first time I've recorded anything in my new office, which is really, I like it a lot. It's really nice and bright and has big windows, so it's fun. But I'm a professor of women's history and medieval history at Baylor. I got my PhD at Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, just a few years ago. And I've been pretty much teaching at Baylor ever since. So been here for a long time. And my area of specialty is women's history at Baylor. When I first came on tenure track here back in 2008, I constructed two courses, a sequence of two courses that were on women in the ancient world and the Western tradition. So ancient Greece and Rome primarily up to 1500. And I'm sorry, up to 1200, and then a medieval up through modern course, 1200 through suffrage. And for those of you who have read my book or have looked at the chapter, what you will notice is that my book pretty much covers that time frame from the ancient world up through suffrage. And so while I began my journey as a women's history professor, focusing on medieval history, my husband also was earning his Master's of Divinity to be a pastor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which wasn't very far from where I got my PhD. And so from the very beginning of my academic journey, I've also had this ministry journey. And this ministry journey has been rooted in the Southern Baptist world, which at the time when I started working on my PhD was in 1997. And that was at the same time that the Baptist battles, they'd been gearing up since really starting in the late 70s and the 80s. But it was in the late 90s that they began moving towards what becomes the famous Baptist Faith and Message of 2000, which articulates that women are called to submit graciously to the authority of their husbands and that women cannot be pastors. So my journey into academia, into women's history, also began in this world in which women were ordained to be under the authority of men. So is that a little bit helpful to give some background?
Yes, definitely. So, let's talk about your story or your overall
Yeah,
message of your book. If you can summarize
yeah,
it in maybe like 3 minutes, how
yeah.
would you describe it?
Yeah, I can do that. I tell people a lot that this book has the easiest thesis that I've really ever argued, and that is that biblical womanhood isn't biblical. And so the story of this book, although it's clearly rooted in what I've been teaching for a very long time in women's history and my knowledge as a scholar, it is also rooted in my experiences as a pastor's wife. And in 2016, my husband and I had been on this journey where we realized that we could no longer stay, that the attitudes of the church that we are currently at were hardening about women's roles. And it reached sort of an escalation point where we were at kind of a crisis ourselves. And we decided to try to do something about it. And one of the things, very innocuous thing that we tried to do was to get a woman to co-teach high school youth Sunday school. It wasn't me, actually. People think it was me, but it wasn't actually me. And that resulted in my husband being fired about 3 weeks later. That was sort of the final straw. And I still at that point wasn't thinking about writing a book. I was mostly in crisis for a little bit. But as we began working through that, I began writing on, I write for Patheos, for the Anxious Bench, which is a religious history blog, and I've been writing on it since 2015. And if people who pay attention to my blog, if they look starting in 2017, I start writing on topics of women in the church. And this was sort of me slowly thinking, because I came to this understanding that even though I couldn't help myself anymore, that what I knew about women's roles in the church was something that the general church population did not know. And what I knew was that our understanding of biblical womanhood, this idea that women are always to follow the leadership of men, which includes in the household and also excluding them from leadership in the church, that this was rooted in culture, not in the Bible. And so that me beginning to write on those topics on my blog, my very first one was actually, I'm sorry. The first one was, I started writing about Romans and Paul and how we have misunderstood Paul. And then I wrote a piece on Paige Patterson. And then I started a series called Disrupting Christian Patriarchy. And it was at that point that I had an editor reach out to me, and I began conversations that eventually led to me agreeing to write The Making of Biblical Womanhood.
Okay. So is that the whole story?
That's my story. And I mean, I didn't flesh out the book very much, but essentially what the book is it walks us through human history from the ancient world all the way through really up till the modern world, showing how what we understand about the Bible isn't always from the Bible itself, but it's from human history that we carry to the Bible. And my argument is that our understanding of women's roles in the church has been more shaped by the patriarchy of human history than it has actually been shaped by the Bible itself. So I walk us all the way through, and my final chapter is sort of a call, which I think it's my final chapter that has gotten me in so much trouble. But my final chapter is sort of a call for us to realize that what the church has been doing to women is harmful, and that it's not godly, and that we need to change. So.
Right. And I think a lot of people might take it personal because it's something that they hold very dear. It's something that they hold to being biblical, and this is what God is teaching me as a man, as a woman. And so it kind of steps on their toes a little, right?
That's exactly right. It's bound up in identity. It's what we believe. And I mean, I wrote this, I think, in the very first chapter of the book, when I was at Chapel Hill, when I was still very much a part of this complementarian belief system. And, I remember my peers in the program being like, I don't understand why women believe this stuff. And I was like, I know why they believe it. We believe it because we believe this is what God has called us to do. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a matter of faith. So it was a matter of identity for me too, which is why I think it took me so long to untangle it, because I wanted to do what God called me to do. And I believed for a very long time that complementarianism was what God called me to do.
All right. That was my experience too. When I started to learn about this topic, I grew up going to churches where women were
Mhm.
preaching, and so
Yeah.
it wasn't a radical thing for me to like believe that that's biblical. But when I came across certain people online like John MacArthur, Mike Winger, a lot of the reformed people online with a popular presence online, that's where I first heard about this concept of biblical womanhood. And the language often it just comes across like this is the biblical view. And which Christian woman wouldn't want to hold to the biblical view? For those that might not understand what we're talking about necessarily with the term egalitarianism
Mhm.
or complementarianism, do you think you can briefly define it for them? And then we can go into the criticism, the pushback that egalitarians commonly receive.
Yeah, so both of them are actually pretty modern terms, at least in the way that they are used right now. So complementarianism is a term that was really that began to be used in the late 1980s by a group of men, and they really were all men, who were some of the founders of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, also associated with the founding of the Gospel Coalition, also some of the guys who were responsible for the English Standard Version. And they got together and decided that one of the most significant problems with the church today was that women were assuming leadership over men, and that women were not maintaining what they believed to be the calling on women to be subordinate to their husbands within marriage, as well as to not be leaders in the church. And so they began advocating for what they called complementary roles between women and men, but they're not really complementary because they always put women underneath men. So they're hierarchical, but nonetheless, they argue that God ordained men to be leaders in the home as well as in the church, and that God ordained women to be helpers, which they interpreted as being under the authority of men. And so they argued that God's plan for the best flourishing, and that's John Piper's word, of women and men, was to uphold this complementary arrangement between women and men, which they also argued was rooted in scripture and was countercultural. Egalitarianism is a term that emerged most famously with the CBE, which is the Council for Christians for Biblical Equality, which was founded at the same time that the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood was founded. So the CBMW, Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, promoted complementarity. The CBE, Christians for Biblical Equality, argued that God did not ordain a hierarchy between the sexes, that God actually used women and men in all sorts of giftings, and that God did not ordain a hierarchical arrangement within marriage, but that God actually sees women and men as both created equally in the image of God and worthy of having the same callings, called by God in the same ways. So, both of these terms, they're very recent, although there actually are historic uses, especially of complementarity in the past. And it's interesting that that term really first began to emerge in history in the 17th century with a secular, really not with a philosophical movement that argued that women were intellectually inferior to men and physically inferior to men, and therefore should remain within the household and not out in the public sphere and under male authority. And so you can think about, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the famous philosophers, French philosophers, who advocated for this. So complementarity is an older term, but it began to be used in this sort of new way in the 1980s. And new way, I mean, rooted in Christianity. They argued that this was a biblical model. And it was a direct response to what they called to Christian feminism. And they saw that the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, which advocated that women should not be treated differently from men in the law, in economics, in culture, et cetera, that women should be able to have the same jobs as men, the same pay as men, that there should be help in providing childcare for women so that they were able to work in the same ways as men, as well as healthcare for women, that women should not be fired from jobs for being pregnant or getting married, which was actually a common practice, and that women should have the right to equal pay. And so all of these sort of, advocating became associated with the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. It was also tied with the abortion movement, which has played out somewhat today. But this response of Christians was that this fight for women's equality in the workplace, in the law, et cetera, was anti-Christian, that it was expressly non-biblical. And so you can sort of see the roots of complementarianism. Maybe, it's interesting as a historian to think about it, but with the fight among conservative Christians against the Equal Rights Amendment for women. And so you can see this playing out where there's this understanding that if you are godly, that you believe in the subordination of women to men. And if you are not godly, and if you do not take the Bible seriously, then you are for the equality of the sexes. Now, those terms, that term equality has gotten more complicated because we have the term now that we also use called equity. And there's an understanding that within feminism, that there are some women who are not able to have the same equality as other women because of their race, because they are Black women, because they are women of color, et cetera. And so now we have to think about both equity as well as equality when we think about the push for women to have the same rights as men. So is that a little helpful? That may be too much.
No, that's a good segue for the next question. Is egalitarianism feminism?
So, I would say that this depends on who one is. I think the term feminism has become loaded in a way among Christians that it really shouldn't be. It has become mostly associated with not being Christian. And I think that's why a lot of Christian women who actually would support the equality of women and would support women as preachers and teachers and leaders, and would support women being, not being under male authority, even within the household, that's not necessarily women's calling, they would still balk at being called a feminist. And I think that's because of the association in the 1960s and 70s with not only equality, but also with what was seen as a blurring between gender distinctiveness, and maybe even this idea that there is nothing that makes a woman different from a man, and that includes, everything about her. And so some saw this as dangerous. This is actually not an entirely accurate equation. Feminism is a very broad movement, just like complementarianism is a very broad movement. And so there are people on every end of the spectrum within feminism, just as there are with complementarians. But so, for me, I'm actually very comfortable with the term feminist because, first of all, I am a white woman, and I understand historically that feminism is rooted in some ways within white women. I think it's not the only thing that we should be concerned about. By calling attention to myself as a feminist, it also means that I recognize that we need to be more inclusive, and that me speaking doesn't mean that I speak for all women. And so in some ways that term is helpful for me because it reminds me that there are more women's voices that we need to listen to. But when I use the term, I use it in the sense that I do believe that God calls women and men to do many of the same things, that he equates them with the same dignity, and that he equates them with the same, the ability to carry the same authority, and that he does not call women to be subordinate to men in all circumstances and for all time. So to me, there's not really a conflict, but I also understand, in fact, on my Twitter feed today, I just saw, a person put out that that they think that all feminists, essentially are, believe in the right to execute unborn children. And I mean, that's just such an over exaggeration. And it shows us how much Christians misunderstand feminism. And it's ironic to me because complementarians all the time accuse me of not understanding the differences within complementarianism. And my response is, well, I do understand that there's a great deal of diversity within complementarianism. And it's interesting to me that they still boil feminism down to really a very narrow and very small definition. So I think maybe there's a response on both sides. There's a great misunderstanding of what feminism actually is and how feminism can indeed be Christian.
Do you think there's a difference in that spectrum of feminism where your Christian worldview will guide you in your feminist convictions?
Oh yeah, my feminism is rooted in my Christianity, because I believe, in some ways, I think that the way that I interpret feminism is this idea that women and men are created equal in the image of God, and that women, because of this, and that patriarchy, which is this system that always places women under the authority of men, that this is actually what is not Christian and not biblical. So while I do understand that feminism is rooted in a historical context, it really emerges in the late 19th century with the beginning of suffrage, and it goes through several evolutions throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. So I understand that it is a very historically rooted phenomenon, but it is also a phenomenon that I think gets at what helps us to understand that women are created equal in the image of God, and that means that their personhood is completely is not inferior to the personhood of men. And I argue, although I understand why people don't like this, I understand why people push back against this, but I have gotten to the place where I do believe that complementarian arguments that argue that there is something about the way about a woman inherent in her very creation that makes her unable to wield or exercise authority over men. I believe this is an ontological claim. I believe that it is claiming that when you claim that there is something about the way a person is born that makes them unable to have leadership over another person, you are claiming that that person is created less, that person is created unequal. And so I would argue that that is not a biblical or Christian worldview.
Right, and I would just ask complementarians listening right now to just pause and try not to give the common response to that, and just pause and try to think, okay, like what is Beth really getting at here?
Yeah, and I mean, I know sometimes it's sort of interesting because I completely understand why women are afraid of this. I understand why women object to this. I was one of these women for a very, very long time. It took me a long time to unfold this. So even though this is where I am now, I am not saying that all women have to meet me where I am. I am not saying that I don't understand. I completely understand why women choose to remain within complementarian places. But what I do hope that they hear is that there are concerns about that place, about complementarianism, that are legitimate, and that women who can be faithful Bible-believing Christians, just like me. I am a very faithful. In fact, I think people would be surprised if they realize how comfortable I still am within the conservative, if you think about the conservative spectrum. But I am a faithful Bible-believing Christian just like them, and I disagree with complementarianism, not because I don't believe the Bible, but because I do believe the Bible.
Right. And before we move on to the other criticism, I received a question on my social media from Cecilia, and she's wondering if you can find something in common with all of the women in the Bible who God has used as leaders throughout Scripture? She's asking, is it courage? Is it obedience?
Oh, so so I think it's hard. I think we can find several characteristics among these women. I'm not sure if we can find one commonality, although I would say probably the greatest commonality is obedience, is faith. Is that, and if you look in the New Testament and you look at Jesus's response to the male apostles and Jesus's response to the women who he talks to, the male apostles, the male disciples, he often is chastising them for their lack of faith. But for women, he always says, he says frequently, women, you are of great faith. And women see and understand Jesus in ways that the disciples often don't. And I think this is amazing when we see this in the New Testament, because I think this clearly is what, this lifting women up in a way like you would expect the men would know what is going on. But we often see the women are the ones. And, I often point people to the fact that I think it's no accident that when, we have Jesus, that Peter is the first to recognize who Jesus really is. He says, Lord, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And what we also see is that a woman says a very similar thing to Peter. God just doesn't leave us with just a man saying this to God, saying this about Jesus, but Martha says the same thing. And, she says, you are the Christ. She recognizes who Jesus is too. And so again, I think that is that's an intentional that we see in the Bible, where women recognize and that Jesus speaks to and uses women in the same ways that he uses men. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter talking about how there's preaching this Mother's Day going on about Tabitha. And someone rightly pointed out how Tabitha is called a female disciple. And, and it's just, if we think and pause on that, it's like, there were women disciples. We know this. We have even the name of one of these women disciples. And so it makes it really hard to argue that women aren't serving in leadership, serving with Jesus in the same ways that men are, because they were. So I would definitely say faith is one of them, obedience too. I would also say courage. It may not, I think for all of these women, I mean, we think about Mary. And I think one of the most overlooked passages that modern evangelicals, we often shy away from the Magnificat. We shy away because we are afraid of Catholic implications, although I think we have an unreasonable fear about that. But at the same time, one of the things that we miss is that Mary, this choice that Mary made, this following and obedience, the courage that this took. I mean, it could have cost her her life, and yet she believed and she followed. And she was much more, Joseph is much more hesitant, but Mary, it's like almost instantaneous. She believes and she follows and she agrees. So this is a pattern. We do see this. I'm thinking through my head. We don't see every woman do this, but we do see a lot of women. So I would say that there are patterns, the patterns of biblical womanhood that we see actually in the Bible do not match the patterns of biblical womanhood that ideologies like complementarianism teach us to embrace.
The popular Mary and Martha, where Jesus said, no, she's doing the right thing right now
Right.
by not
Yeah.
helping you.
Yeah. Well, and that whole story, I've talked a lot about that story. It's a fascinating story because we always put Martha in the kitchen in that story. We see her as doing domestic duties, but the word that is actually used about her is the word for ministry. It's the same word that's used for all of the disciples. It's the same word that's used for Paul. But yet when we get to Martha, to that incident, we interpret it as domestic duties when that's not what that word actually means. She was doing ministry like the disciples. And so that's even a story that we have put in our own context, our own understanding of women's work, and women's work is domestic. So therefore, Martha was doing domestic work. which is not actually what the Bible tells us.
Interesting. I keep thinking about how the women went to the tomb, and in the Bible it says, "Seek and you will find." And so the men
Yes.
could have easily have gone and found the empty tomb, but the women, they were courageous. They didn't just give up on Jesus. They
Right.
went and they cared about him enough to go do what followed the next day,
Right.
right? And they were
Yes.
rewarded. And again, they believed right away, and
Right.
the men didn't believe them, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's this fascinating, juxtaposition between women and men. And once again, we see women are, Dorothy L. Sayers said it, they were the first at the cradle and the first at the cross and the first at the tomb. And so, I mean, when I think about how patriarchal the biblical world was, it is just remarkable how women are lifted out and elevated, and God shows us that women were in these prominent positions, throughout both the Old Testament and New Testament.
Right. It's almost like we want to say that, because I remember having a moment when I realized, hey, women were disciples too, because you
Mm-hmm.
just read it in your own worldview, right? You
Yeah.
just think, no, they were disciples, they were men. But
Right.
it's almost like we want to say, well, these are like more important disciples, and the women are like over here just learning. But
Right.
everyone was doing their part as disciples. Some were financing, some were cooking,
Right.
some were doing whatever they could.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. We approach all of these things, these tasks with a hierarchical framework, and we say, oh, the men's work was more important. That was the leadership work, whereas the women's work was less important, was the supportive work. But those are not actually distinctions we see in the Bible. Those are distinctions that we have brought to the text. Which is really what I'm trying to get people to see, is that we have carried so much to the text when it comes to understanding women and men's roles.
So, a lot of pushback. Men are feeling really attacked, especially Christian men, and in particular, complementarian men, of course.
Yeah.
But because they hear words like toxic masculinity, and it does
Mhm.
touch on their identity. And so, what would you say about what is toxic masculinity? What do you think is, biblical masculinity, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, my husband and I were in youth ministry for many, many years. And it always, as much as I saw pressures put on women to conform to a particular image, even to a particular beauty image, there was a great deal of pressure even put on married women. And you can think about, all of the, be a hot smoking wife and all of these unrealistic pressures that are put on women, that it's up to them to keep their husbands sexually faithful, and part of that is that their appearance, and totally unrealistic pressures put on women that have nothing to do with the Bible, that have to do with our own warped understandings of bodies. And those same pressures are put on men with toxic masculinity. I mean, this idea that men have to be these rugged outdoors, aggressive types of men, these alpha males. And, most men actually aren't like that. Men are just as diverse as women are, in the ways, whereas women, well, there are some women who are much more passive and much more quieter and much more, fit that submissive role very well because that's part of their characteristics. There's a lot of women who aren't. And the same with men. I think this is damaging, this idea that that if they are godly men, that they are these aggressive leaders, and that they even look a certain way, that that they don't wear certain colors, they don't wear things that make them look too feminine, and that they are these leaders in the home, and instructing their children and their wives, and leaders in the church, and all of this, and that pressure that it puts on men. And I even think about like the pressure of income. When you tell a man that he has to carry the entire income of the household, and that if he is allowing his wife to work or relying on her income, then he has failed in some way. that pressure is just incredible. And so, I mean, it's like, and this has nothing to do with Christianity. These values are not found in the Jesus way. I mean, if you look at what Jesus calls us to do, they are things that we have carried to it by our own culture, and we have grafted them onto Christianity, and it is toxic, not just because the harm that it does to other people, but because of the harm it does to us. When we try to make, we have this, we want people to look like us. We want people to act like us. We want the way we are to be the right way. And that is not how God has created us. And so I think toxic masculinity hurts men, puts unrealistic pressures on them. It forces them into roles that many of them aren't really designed for, called for, fit naturally with. And it keeps women from doing the things that maybe they are called to. And so you create these really unhealthy balances within marriage. And it is just no surprise. I mean, when you are forcing people into these roles, it's no surprise to me that there are often so much problems within marriage. And so some people fit really well with these roles because this is who they are and they fit very naturally with them. But so some people may be like that and they're like, this has never been a problem for me. And I'm like, great, that's fine. You can keep doing that. Just don't say that it's biblical and that other people have to do it too. And so that's all I'm pushing against. I am not saying that all women have to work, all women have to be leaders. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying let people be who God has created them to be, and don't try to impose how God has created us, especially as women and men, to make all people be like that. That's really what I'm pushing against. I tell people, I'm not expecting everyone to agree with me. I'm just wanting them to think about having more grace and realizing that just because something hasn't hurt them doesn't mean it hasn't hurt other people. And that's, toxic masculinity isn't about attacking men. It is about helping them see how this structure, this idea that has been created of what men should be, harms both women and men. And it is not rooted in the Bible.
Seeing both women and men as individuals. So would you say
Yes.
that your views on what is masculinity, is it strictly biological, or there are some, other?
When I was writing the book, my original final chapter was going to be called Remaking Biblical Womanhood. And by the time I got to that chapter, I didn't want to write that anymore. And so I changed because what I realized was that I don't think we should try to remake, try to say this is what it means to be a man or this is what it means to be a woman, because so much what we think about that really is culturally constructed. I mean, a very simple thing that I use in my classes all the time is the color pink. The color pink used to be a masculine color. It began to be used. Women actually intentionally took it over in the early part of the 20th century and began popularizing it for women. And then by the time we get to the 40s and 50s, it becomes a female color. But that has nothing to do with the Bible. That has nothing to do with masculinity or femininity. It is a cultural construction that we have added on to what it means to be a man or a woman. So I think what I would push against is people all the time want to say it's just biology. But the problem is that biology is always understood within a historical context. And so we always add things to that, to what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And so when we think, I think it's impossible for us to really think in terms strictly of biology because we are always carrying our cultural context to it. And that's really just what I want people to see. As I said, I'm very comfortable with being a woman and seeing that as being different from a man. But at the same time, I do not think that, so much of the ways that we understand being a woman today is actually created more in culture than it is something that is innate with me being female. Is that a little bit helpful?
Yeah, I feel like there might be some questions about, for example, the whole controversy with marriage, whereas, are you saying that, I almost don't want to say it, but the whole debate on homosexuality, and so that's not what you're saying?
I'm that, no, I mean, people often go there, and I'm not going there. I am arguing that the way we understand being a woman and being a man within Christian conservative culture is constructed more by history and culture than it is by the Bible. I would also say that the way that we have argued, we have really warped our understanding of sexuality because we become so afraid. And we have responded to people in really poor ways. And I do think that as Christians, we have done a lot of wrong. And I think we need to pause and we need to think about, the harm that we have done. But at the same time, I also think that when you argue, for me to say that biblical womanhood isn't biblical, I'm just talking about women within this context. I mean, that's really where I see my voice. God calling me to use my voice here is in my skills as a women's historian. And so that's where I mostly, I can talk and I can make arguments, but this is mostly where I am staying and arguing. People can add words to what I say. They can try to push me into other places, and they do that all the time. But I'm not the one. This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about biblical womanhood, which I do believe is is more culturally constructed than grounded in the Bible or even grounded in biology. I mean, if you think about this, these arguments are that there is something about that women, that the ideas that women are created less than men has always been rooted in biology, saying that there is something, that women's brains aren't as big as men, that women's bodies are weaker than men, that there is something about the way we are created that makes us less and to remain under the authority of men. And I'm arguing that this is a wrong, that this is not a Christian approach to who women and men are.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that no one misinterprets what
Well,
we're
yeah,
just specifically talking about.
This is what I'm talking. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about right now. Yeah, here and right now. I can point people towards resources. I do think we've had, as I said, I'm very comfortably Baptist, very comfortably Baptist. And I just try to reiterate that to folk. It's so interesting to me that when you say women should be preachers, that people all of a sudden say all of these other things about you too. And I'm like, do you see what you're doing there? And so, people just need to pause and need to listen to what people are really saying and need to be more gracious than we have been, because we've done a lot of harm.
I agree. Thank you so much, Beth, for your time.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere you would want to point people towards so they can learn more about you and what you're doing?
I'm on social media, mostly Twitter and Instagram, a little bit on Facebook. And you can also find me on Pathos, Writing on the Anxious Bench.
And you have announced recently that you're going to turn this book into a trilogy, are you not?
I am. So I am carrying, it took me a while to decide that I wanted to do this. But I am doing my next book. It's going to be called Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And it's going to tackle this idea of being a pastor's wife, but also the issue of female ordination through history. So I'm really excited about it. And my third book is going to be called Losing Our Medieval Religion, where I'm going to talk about how Christians have really misunderstood so much because we have a very short-sighted view of history. And so I'm going to make an argument for why we need to not forget our past.
Right, that is so interesting, and I'm so glad I found you because a year
Yeah.
ago I was looking, hey, how can I learn more about women in the ancient world?
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I can point you towards a lot of resources. So, and a lot, I have a lot in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, but on my writings, I often point people to more. So you can follow me on the Anxious Bench and find more resources.
okay, awesome. I will do that. And so far, I'm loving your book, so thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you.